Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, Benjamin Netanyahu doubles down on his commitment to a Rafah invasion, and analysis from Jonathan Conricus on the recent pullout in southern Gaza. The ongoing game of nerves as Hamas uses the hostages to cause a nation to writhe. Plus, courting the Jewish vote in the U.S., how it may affect policy towards Israel. And an award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker chronicles the events and heroism on October 7th. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says a date has been set to invade Rafah, Hamas's last stronghold. Netanyahu insists Israel won't accept a ceasefire deal that prevents that invasion and achieving total victory over Hamas. On Monday, Netanyahu announced Israel is not finished with Hamas in Gaza.
We're working all the time to achieve our goals, primarily the release of our hostages and achieving a complete victory over Hamas. This victory requires entry into Rafah and the elimination of the terrorist battalions there. It will happen. There's a date.
After months of on and off negotiations, the U.S. has reportedly proposed a new ceasefire deal. It would see a 6-week halt in the fighting and exchange 40 hostages for 900 Palestinians imprisoned in Israel. Hamas is expected to respond to this latest proposal by Tuesday night. If they agree, the truce could begin as soon as Wednesday. The Biden administration has warned it could change its policy towards Israel if it goes forward with an invasion of Rafah. There are also signs it would like to see Netanyahu replaced as leader. Monday, the U.S. Secretary of State held high-level talks with the leader of Netanyahu's opposition, who might be more pliable to White House demands.
A hostage deal is doable. It is a difficult deal. This is a deal we might not like, but it's doable, and therefore it needs to be made.
5 families related to the hostages met with Pope Francis Monday, who they say described Hamas in no uncertain terms.
He called Hamas evil, which they are. He called them bad guys and evil. And he was very clear that the hostages need to come home.
As the IDF regroups and the U.S. calls for peace, some Israelis are taking to the streets, demanding the total defeat of Hamas. They say the world is putting pressure in the wrong place.
Instead of telling the international community to place pressure on Hamas to release the hostages, they're placing pressure on Netanyahu and our government. We didn't start the war, they did, okay? They murdered 1,200 of our people.
The mood in general is a grim determination to win the war.
Military analyst and IDF Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff says most Israelis are firmly behind achieving victory over Hamas.
There's a very loud counter-movement, and I emphasize loud because the overwhelming majority who are not speaking are the bulk of the population, the reservists and their families.
Chodoff says it's important to pray for Israel now.
Pray for Israel's well-being, pray for Israel's safety, and pray for victory, because ultimately that's where the well-being is going to come from.
Meanwhile, at the World Court, an Israeli ally is under attack. Germany is rejecting an accusation by Nicaragua that it's violating international law by providing arms and support to Israel in its fight against Hamas. Nicaragua urged the judges to stop Germany from sending arms shipments, claiming it enables acts of genocide in Gaza.
Israel withdrew its troops from southern Gaza last week. We asked Jonathan Conricus, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, what he made of this move.
You can read different things into it. One thing that you can read is that the IDF is pulling out troops as a tactical realignment in order for them to rest, replenish, and to get prepared for next missions. That's one way of assessing. A second line of thought would be that this is the Israeli implementation of a Biden-Netanyahu phone call where certain demands were made by President Biden, enhance humanitarian aid, pull out troops. one could read that this is an implementation of that. And the third option is that Israel may be bracing or preparing itself to fry bigger fish, Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Iranians. Any of the options and a combination of these three different options can be correct, and time will tell which one it is.
Tell us about the north, and what does that situation look like right now?
Well, for the last 3.5, 4 weeks, there have been more rockets fired at Israeli civilians from the north, from Lebanon, than there have been from Gaza. And there are still 100,000 Israeli civilians who are evacuated from their homes half a year. That is an unprecedented thing in Israeli history, never before seen in the Middle East, that so many Israelis are evicted out of their homes. Hezbollah, I think, are just where they want to be in terms of the intensity of fighting. It's a good place for them. They don't want to escalate and they don't want to de-escalate. But the only problem that Hezbollah has is that as long as there's fighting, Israel does two things very effectively. One is to strip away layer after layer of Hezbollah infrastructure in southern Lebanon. And the second thing is that Israel is killing a lot of Hezbollah operatives, battle-hardened and experienced operatives that will no longer be terrorizing Israeli civilians. Something along the lines of more than 300 terrorists have been killed in Lebanon already. So it's not all a rosy picture for Hezbollah or for their Iranian masters, but the bottom line is that we are in a situation where we could go from this bad situation to something much, much worse.
You were in a briefing right after the war began where Israel proposed that they would set up a humanitarian corridor or area. What was the response?
Well, the response here was a surprising one. One you would expect UN and humanitarian organizations to say, well, great. Let's do a humanitarian zone and let's make sure that civilians are safe. Let's move them temporarily out of the fighting and enhance their chances of getting out of this alive. But the answer that Israel got was no. No, you, Israel, you cannot move people from the north to the south. And no, we, the UN, are not going to help you build a humanitarian zone. And I think that was a cardinal sin and a very important decision made by UNRWA, perhaps not independently. I assess that it was made under duress with influence by Hamas, whereby Hamas told UNRWA through its many people who are Hamas members and work inside UNRWA as well. Of course, the situation on the ground today would have been totally different. If there'd been a humanitarian zone, then both Khan Yunis and Rafah wouldn't be full with internally displaced Palestinians, and Israel could have been way past the last assault on Rafah, and we would have been talking about starting the rebuilding process of the Gaza Strip now, instead of still talking about main combat operations and the need to go into Rafah, cut the tunnels, and take out the last remaining Hamas battalions.
Final question, Jonathan. You've alluded to it. The figure 33,000 civilians that have died. What do you think about that?
The fact that there are civilian casualties is an unfortunate result of Hamas's strategy and tactics, and IDF is still applying the principles of distinction and proportionality. It tries to strike only the military assets, and it tries to strike with just enough force in order to get the military job done, but minimizing collateral damage or the killing of civilians. It's a very challenging environment, and I suggest anybody, before criticizing Israel for how we're operating, please think of the fact that while all of this is happening, while we're fighting a devious and morally void enemy that is using its own civilians as human shields, we are also doing so while our civilians are within striking range. We do not have the time or the leisure to be lenient and laid back. And the sad reality is that those who are jeopardizing the civilians is, of course, Hamas, and they're doing it a lot with the help of UNRWA and other organizations in Gaza.
Well, great perspective, Jonathan Conricus. Thanks for your expertise and analysis.
Up next, Hamas continues its game of Nurs with Israel, using the hostages as leverage.
Since October 7th, Hamas has used the hostages for leverage against Israel. And as the nation's anguish continues, so does the sense of helplessness felt by hostage family members. George Thomas has more.
I thought it would be easier after 6 months of interviewing, but it's not.
Since October 7th, Liran Berman has traveled virtually non-stop to tell his story, carrying around his neck a simple message: bring them home.
You describe what the last 6 months has been like for you, sir.
A roller coaster of emotion, mostly hellish. We have no good days, we have okay moments.
Berman's twin brothers, Gali and Ziv, among more than 130 hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza. He and others like him are pleading with Qatari leaders to pressure the terror group to release the hostages.
Because we know that they are the key player that can facilitate a deal, and we saw that they facilitate the first deal.
As the war grinds on, these families grow increasingly desperate, with no resolution in sight for their loved ones.
My life it stopped in 7 October, and all I'm doing is just fight for her.
Among them, Simona Steinbrecher, whose daughter Doran was captured on October 7th from Kibbutz Kfar Aza. In January, Hamas released a video of Doran and 2 other Israeli hostages. Thousands of Israelis are taking their fight to the streets, calling on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to strike a deal to free the captives. Meanwhile, at the Shifahim Hotel, just north of Tel Aviv, hundreds of survivors from Kibbutz Kfar Aza still find themselves in limbo 6 months after Hamas changed their world.
It's about almost 7 p.m. here at Hotel Shifahim. It's an unusual scene because you have members of the Jewish community right behind me who are saying their evening prayers.
In the last 6 months, this hotel has been converted for members of the Kfar Aza kibbutz. About 400 people today call this place their home. Mobile homes are set up next to the hotel to accommodate more families. 52 residents of Kibbutz Kfar Aza died October 7th, including Karen Flasher's parents, who still struggles from the nightmare of that day.
They're not coming back, and there's nothing I can do and no one that can help me bring them back. So for me, supposedly, I can start healing, but it's not possible, because this is not just me.
Recently, these kibbutz residents confronted a Swiss Red Cross delegation visiting the hotel, demanding to know why the aid agency isn't doing more to exert diplomatic pressure on Hamas.
And if the authorities, whoever they are, state actors, non-state actors, don't give the Red Cross access, yes, then you cannot help. It's basic as that.
An Israeli team returned from Cairo after negotiations with Hamas to release the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. So far, both sides remain far apart. George Thomas, CBN News, Tel Aviv.
Coming up, the mounting drive to capture the Jewish vote in America, what it means for U.S.-Israel policy.
The 2024 presidential election is seen as too close to call, and one factor that could tip the balance is the U.S. relationship with Israel. CBN's chief political analyst David Brody explains why.
Navigating how he handles the war in Israel is getting tougher for Joe Biden, not only as president, but also in his quest to win re-election. A consistent outcry by his party's progressive wing is getting louder and larger, pushing for action against Israel for what they call a genocide in Gaza. Following the recent tragedy involving aid workers, the Biden administration took a stronger tone, calling on Israel to take concrete steps to end the humanitarian suffering, or else.
If there's no changes to their policy and their approaches, then there's going to have to be changes to ours.
The question of how far those changes go is key because Biden is trailing in the polls. A drastic shift against Israel could further fracture the Democrats' base, putting key swing states at risk in November. For example, The number of Democrats choosing uncommitted over Biden in key swing state primaries has been jarring. It began in February with Michigan at roughly 13%, then almost 19% in Minnesota. This month, 8% in Wisconsin. Rick Klein is political director for ABC News.
He needs Michigan. And I tell you what, this election seems, at least in those Rust Belt states, they're going to be one at the margins.
Yeah, I think that's right, David. And look, Michigan is a little less close than some of the other battleground states, 150,000 votes or so. But more than, almost more than 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the primary. So if a big chunk of them decide to stay home or vote Donald Trump, then you start to see a real difference. Joe Biden really can't become president if he doesn't win Michigan.
Later this month comes Pennsylvania, which has the country's fourth largest Jewish population. Middle East analyst Jake Novak spent time as media director for the Israel consulate in New York.
If there's any state in the country where the Jewish vote actually means something, it's Pennsylvania.
Since it has about 3% of the voting population, Biden will need to perform a political tap dance between progressives and Jewish Democrats in Pennsylvania and similar states.
The biggest problem is that he's trying to dance at two weddings. That's an old Yiddish phrase. And you can't do that.
On the Republican side, Donald Trump is also weighing in. As president, he took a strong pro-Israel stance throughout his term, although recent comments about quickly ending the war have raised eyebrows.
What I said very plainly is get it over with and let's get back to peace and stop killing people. I'm not sure that I'm loving the way they're doing it because you got to have victory. Israel is absolutely losing the PR war.
Trump has certainly had a reputation of being very, very strongly pro-Israel, but you're right. Some of the comments he's made have made people question whether that's an unending commitment or if there's limitations to that.
Even with his isolationist views, there's little thought that Trump will push too far against the Jewish state.
My expectation is you're not going to hear a lot of kind of public criticism from Trump toward Netanyahu. There's no real upside in that.
At the end of the day, Israel and Jewish people and Christians who support Israel know that Donald Trump has Israel's back.
Some aren't so confident that progressive Democrats will have Biden's back.
Could it cost Biden the election if it's close?
Well, it's very likely to be a very close election. In that sense, almost everything could be the difference maker. But it's very easy to see a scenario where this is a defining issue. And when the history of the 2024 election is written, that this is among the factors that determine its outcome.
David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
Still ahead, Hollywood screenwriter and Israeli-American Dan Gordon telling the story of October 7th before it's forgotten.
It's been 6 months since the October 7th attack. Right after it happened, many analysts warned that the narrative surrounding October 7th would shift and Israel would be perceived as the aggressor. To counter that perspective, Israeli-American filmmaker Dan Gordon went to work on a 4-part documentary. Here's part 1 of our interview. Dan, it's so great to be with you. We go back to 2006, the Second Lebanon War.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful to see you again. We literally dodged rockets together.
We did, down in Sderot. Yeah. So you're here now in Jerusalem, and you've been here for several weeks, and you're really doing a special project. Tell us about it.
I'm doing a 4-part documentary series for TBN. Which will have 2 or 3 specials leading up to the documentary. So it's close to 7 hours of programming about the massacre of October 7th. And it's called October 7th, 2023. And it's divided up. The first hour is called The Horrors. The second hour is called The Heroism. The third hour is called Hysteria, Hatred, and History. And the fourth hour is called The Hope. So we're really trying to cover what happened and its aftermath and its implications for the future as thoroughly as we can in 4 hours.
What were you doing on October 7th and how did it hit you?
I have an adopted sister who lives here in Israel. She adopted me, I adopted her. It's one of those war stories, but I consider her my sister and she considers me her older brother. And it was the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah, and so I had on WhatsApp sent her a message, Happy Holiday. not expecting her to respond because she's religious and she turns her phone off on Shabbat.
Sure.
And as I sent the message, I got an answer. And the minute I got an answer, I thought something is very wrong, because she does not turn her phone on Shabbat. And she wrote back, very happy indeed, they're sending rockets. And I wasn't terribly concerned, because rockets are,
yeah,
you know, like weather forecasts here. It's like, oh, it's going to rain today, little hail, little rockets, little, you know, that's sort of a fact of Israeli life. And she said, huge barrage all over, much bigger than usual. They've hit parts of Tel Aviv. And I thought, well, this could be a serious round. Then she said, Ephraim, that's her husband, here's small arms fire.
Now, where does she live?
She lives in Kibbutz Saad, right across the street from Kfar Aza, which, as you know, was the site of a horrible massacre. And I said, look, if you can hear small arms fire, you've got an infiltration. And then she says, I hear a lot of small arms fire. And I'm sitting there going, there are terrorists inside her. If she can hear it, there are terrorists inside her kibbutz, or they're at the gate. And I'm really, you know, worried, but I'm 3,000 miles away. There's nothing I can do about it. So I stayed on WhatsApp, going back and forth with her till, you know, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. She didn't know really what had happened until after they were evacuated. It turns out that the terrorists had come to Saad. There was a pitched battle at the gate of Saad, and out of nowhere a tank appeared and fought the terrorists off. The terrorists went into Kfar Aza across the street and killed close to 100 people, I think, there, and took scores captive. I mean, it was a bloodbath in Kfar Aza. It was one of the worst places. So she and her kibbutz were really saved by a miracle. But that's what that opening of the war was for me. It was, you know, there's nothing on the news yet. There was nothing on CNN. There was nothing on ABC, NBC, I-24, CBN, TV. Nobody yet had anything. And then reports started coming out about rockets. And then the first reports about terrorists all through the south of the country.
So October 8th happens, and what's in your heart on October 8th?
I think they had thought that there was something like 1,500 to 2,000 terrorists that had come through. The death toll was, I think, 600 or 800 at that time. They didn't yet have, and the extent of how horrible it was at the Supernova Music Festival, where there were 360, many of them burned alive, girls raped. I mean, just horrific. At the same time, October 8th, the Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine staged a solidarity rally in solidarity with people they knew had just committed mass murder, rapes, mutilations, beheadings. And they said they were standing in full solidarity with the people of Gaza who broke through the wall that's been suffocating them for 75 years and staged a brilliant counteroffensive against their settler colonial oppressors. And I called my manager and I said, it will not be 2 weeks before the narrative is totally changed to Israel is committing genocide against the poor, defenseless people of Palestine, whom Hamas is a legitimate representative of, and they are been caught by this genocidal monster called Israel. And I said, I want to do a documentary that will be just about October 7th, because it's going to be forgotten and it's going to be denied.
We'll have more of our interview with Dan Gordon later. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. You can follow us on social media and access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And please continue to pray for IDF soldiers, for those caught in harm's way, and for the return of all the hostages. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.